The story of Davinci Resolve begins in 1984 when a post-production company called Videotape Associates or VTA developed a color grading system known as Davinci. Later that same year, Davinci broke away from VTA and became its own company called Davinci Systems. In 1986, Davinci Systems was bought by a company called Dynatec. At the time, Davinci Systems was fully a hardware company creating color grading tools which used to cost an upwards of $80,000. By the late 1990s, Davinci had become one of the biggest names in color grading, and one of its most famous systems was the Davinci 2K, which came with the ability to color grade 2K formats, which at the time was a very big deal because TVs were becoming big and brighter, which meant that the demand for higher resolution was just getting started. Actually, it was around this time that it hit me how the Davinci 2K was very popular among filmmakers. And just to give you context, the movie Star Wars Episode 1 was entirely color graded using the Davinci 2K. And honestly, looking back at these machines is kind of fascinating. Compared to the computers we have today, they seem incredibly underpowered. Yet at the time, they represented some of the most advanced color grading technologies in the world. Anyways, 2003 was a very bad year for Davinci, because the parent company of Davinci, Acterna, which was earlier referred to as Dynatec, filed for bankruptcy. But ironically, this did not affect the development of Davinci, and I think that says a lot about how important Davinci had become. Also, it is important to highlight how Davinci was goated around this time, so much so that filmmakers used to travel from all over the world just to access Davinci systems. Just a side note, videos like these are sometimes a bit of tricky to make, and it requires hours and hours of research. And it is my initiative to make sure that I give you the best value for your time. So if you enjoy this type of videos, please consider subscribing and help me reach the goal of 10,000 subscribers by the end of this year. Thank you, and let's get back to the story of Davinci Resolve. Throughout the early 2000s, the industry was evolving from using physical hardware to using software-based systems, which eventually led Davinci Systems to build Resolve in 2004, which was a software alternative to their old hardware. It is good to keep in mind that Davinci was still a color grading tool, and despite creating Resolve, it came bundled with hardware, costing an upwards of $200,000. And that is considering the configuration that you chose. This was until 2009 when Blackmagic obtained Davinci Systems.
You son of a bitch!
Blackmagic was founded by Grant Petty in 2001. It had a reputation of making high-quality cameras and other cinema-related products, but nothing compared to the acquisition of Davinci. Blackmagic acquired Davinci Systems for $10 million, and from that very first day, Grant Petty had one clear goal in mind: to bring the prices of Davinci down and make it accessible to everyone. He couldn't understand why a color grading tool needed to cost $200,000. Grant Petty had worked in post-production himself, and he remembered exactly what it felt like to want great tools and not to be able to afford them. So that experience had shaped everything about how Blackmagic operated.
And I was an engineer, and I was doing support. I couldn't understand how everyone couldn't see that the creative people were the center of the business. I mean, sure, okay, you got to hire the equipment out because it's expensive.
In 2010, Blackmagic made a major breakthrough, because around this time, the engineers at Blackmagic were able to figure out how to make Davinci Resolve to run on a low-end GPU. For context, Davinci Resolve required an expensive GPU to run, and that's why it required expensive and specialized hardware, which also paved way for the release of Davinci Resolve 7, which retailed at $995 for the Mac version and $20,000 for the Linux version. This version of Davinci Resolve was not even close to what we have today, but it was a huge step towards the right direction. Davinci Resolve 7 was not a video editing tool yet, but it came with some amazing features. This version featured a new interface which was less intimidating than the previous ones. It also added support for new file formats, including support for Apple ProRes. This was a big deal for color graders who are receiving footage from editors working in Final Cut Pro. Anyways, the biggest update yet was to be announced in 2011 with the release of version 8. This version was the biggest update for a few reasons. Firstly, it was the version that introduced video editing capabilities to Davinci Resolve. Also, this is the version that introduced OpenCL processing, which meant that Davinci could now run on an even wider range of graphic cards, including those found in regular iMacs and MacBook Pros, bringing the software even closer to ordinary creators. To add icing on the cake, 2011 also marked the year that Blackmagic introduced a free version of Davinci Resolve called Davinci Resolve Lite. Of course, the free version had its own limitations, like it was only limited to 1080p resolution, but this was not a big deal because around this time, 4K resolution was still at its infancy. The free version of Davinci was a step towards the right direction for Davinci Resolve, and without this, Davinci would not be where it is today. Davinci version 8 would also mark the version that introduced Davinci Resolve to Windows, and considering how many editors were using Windows PCs at the time, this dramatically increased the number of people who could access the software. From here onwards, Blackmagic kept upgrading and making Davinci Resolve better and better for its users. Version 9 in 2012 arrived with a redesigned interface and expanded support for more cameras and file types, making it easier for creators coming from different camera systems to bring their footage into Resolve without hassle. Then version 10 in 2013 took a direct aim at the one thing that had always made Davinci Resolve intimidating, and that was the interface. Blackmagic made it significantly more approachable to editors who were discovering the software for the first time. Also, 2013 is the year that the free version of Davinci Resolve was upgraded to support 4K editing and allowed the software to harness dual GPUs for faster rendering. At the time, Davinci was now becoming powerful enough to compete against editing giants the likes of Adobe. It's good to keep in mind that Davinci was the best when it came to color grading, and that's why from version 10 onwards, Davinci Resolve focused on upgrading their editing capabilities each year. Like with the version 11, which was released in 2014, it featured the introduction of audio mixing capabilities. It was still basic compared to what we have today, but that was still a step towards the right direction. Also, it was in 2014 when Blackmagic obtained Fusion. Fusion was an image compositing software, and it was one of the most respected compositing applications in the industry, and it was widely used for creating visual effects and motion graphics. At the time, it existed as a standalone application costing over $1,000. Blackmagic would also offer a free version of Fusion later the same year. As you can imagine, this was exciting news to Davinci users. This step made a lot of editors consider ditching other professional editing tools and switch over to Davinci Resolve. In 2016, Blackmagic would also acquire Fairlight, which was a high-end audio post-production tool for filmmaking. This was exciting news because this meant that Davinci will now have the ability to edit and add effects to audio. Also, the acquisition signaled Blackmagic's intention to make Davinci suitable for professional editing. Both Fusion and Fairlight initially remained separate from Davinci Resolve. This will not change until the release of Davinci Resolve 14 and 15, where both Fusion and Fairlight were finally integrated into Davinci Resolve. And in my opinion, this is the moment that the modern version of Davinci truly began to take shape. Editors could now cut their footage, color grade it, create visual effects, and do professional audio post-production without leaving Davinci Resolve. And from here onwards, most upgrades that Davinci Resolve would receive were performance-based. But the story of Davinci Resolve does not end there, because in April 2026, with Davinci Resolve 21, Blackmagic announced the addition of the photo page editing photos integrated inside Davinci Resolve. To be honest, this is exciting news for me personally, because now it means that if I want to edit my photos, I can just do it inside Davinci Resolve, and I can utilize the node system that I've always enjoyed. And when you step back and look at the bigger picture, it's honestly kind of incredible that a tool that once used to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars has gradually evolved into a platform used by millions of creators around the world, all this for free.